Matty, just as a little introduction, this whole court case is about a class action lawsuit in Southern California in the 1940s. Our whole exhibit is put on by Modal, but we have a few rules before we start. First of all, we're really excited to have you guys here. Second, the exhibit is pretty fragile, so please don't touch anything. We will give you opportunities to touch things and it'll be interactive, but until then, try not to touch anything. Everything's really fragile. Second of all, if you have phones, please turn them off, keep them in your pockets. We don't want you guys to disrupt anybody else within the exhibit. Third, if you have to use the restroom, it's right over here. And please let your teacher or supervisor know before you leave. And lastly, please don't leave the exhibit of the library. As of right now, I'm in charge of you guys, so if you leave, I get in trouble. So keep where I can see you and don't go anywhere beyond where you're supposed to. Hi guys, my name's Matty. Before we get started, I just want to thank you guys for coming. We're really happy to have you guys here. This whole exhibit is about a court case that happened in Southern California in the 1940s, and it's put on by Modal. So again, we're really happy to have you guys here, and we're really excited. Hi, my name's Matty.
And hello, my name is Omar. So today in this section specifically, we're going to be talking about a class action suit, right? We're going to be talking about the 5 families and the 4 school districts and what was happening at that time. And the 5 families, Palomino, Guzman, Estrada, Ramirez, and Mendez, were fighting for desegregation of schools in Southern California, right? And they were fighting specifically for their kids, right? Segregation means separating someone. It's usually by force, usually for their race or because of their minority or for many reasons, right? And desegregation is when they connect back together, right? So desegregation is the opposite of segregation, right?
So the 4 school districts included Westminster, Santa Ana, Garden Grove, and El Medina. And a big part of the reason why this happened was because they were getting unequal treatment, not only in schools but in life. But this case is focused on the desegregation of Mexican schools and white schools in Southern California.
Yeah, and what these 4 school districts, what they were doing is they were segregating them, and their whole argument that they were separate and equal, but the issue was they were not separate, they were not equal. You can see and notice that these Mexican schools would usually have older playgrounds, even sometimes they wouldn't, or water fountains, or facilities like libraries and cafeterias, and even bigger yards, right? And while the American schools would have the bigger yards, they would have the newer playgrounds, they would have the newer discs, they would have better education. Even what they were being taught, they would be taught regular education, while the Mexicans would be taught how to pick crops or how to cook or clean. There was a lot of issues with these schools, and they were not being equal, and these families, they saw that their children are destined to be agriculture workers, which was what all Mexicans were doing and all minorities were working all around the U.S. nationwide. So here we're going to talk about Orange County before World War II, right? So agriculture before the 1920s, right? So 1920s, a lot of immigrants came from Mexico to America, right? Before that, most of the farm workers were Americans, right? Interestingly enough, and segregation wasn't fully there at that time, right? Before the 1920s, before the immigrants, segregation started after there was an influx of immigrants coming from Mexico to America, right? And you can see here, right, in these images, right, you can see that it was diverse. It wasn't just Mexicans, right? In these sections and in this tour, we specifically talk about Mexicans because this is in Orange County, and that is the main community there that was being affected from the segregation that was happening. But there was still many minorities that were working hard labor jobs, just like Chinese immigrants, African Americans, and many more.
Yeah, so if you typically had like a darker skin tone, you didn't have to be from Mexico, but white Americans in Southern California, if you had a darker skin tone, you were considered Mexican. So that's why we use the term Mexican. It's a general term, but it didn't necessarily mean you're from Mexico. But a lot of like minorities, they were considered Mexican.
Even if you had just like a ancestor or anyone that was, you were related to a Mexican, even if you were born here, you weren't considered American, you would be considered Mexican, right? And you can see that women would usually work in packing houses, right? They wouldn't work in factories, even though there was jobs for factories, right? And you can see in this image specifically, right, the packing houses, and here you can see the crates and the oranges and how much there was, right? One more thing I want to highlight before we move on is that even children, 8 to 9-year-olds, would be picking up oranges, right, from on the tree, right? So on the shorter areas of the tree, they would be picking up oranges, and they would call them ratas because in Spanish, because they would be like rats, like they would scurry around and pick up the oranges, and they were pretty short at that time because they're 8 and 9-year-olds. So an American community, right? So these families, right? A lot of them were immigrants, right? And how they met were through festivities, Mexican culture like quinceañeras, Mexican Independence Day, Day of the Dead, and many more Mexican cultural festivities that happened.
Oh, and a lot of also like there was a lot of church events, so like communions and weddings and a lot of the things that we do today, like having block parties, neighborhood parties, or like school events, it's a lot of the similar things that you used to do back then that would connect them all to get them to get a class action lawsuit.
Watch parties also, like they wouldn't watch because they wouldn't have TVs, and a lot of them couldn't afford TVs, right? So they would be huddling around and they would be listening in a radio, right? One thing I want to highlight in this slide is if you see here, right, you guys can notice that it's a muddy street, right? This question is that, what do you guys really notice, right? The noticing is that it's muddy, but there's no pavement, there's no sewer system, right? And that causes that if it's raining a lot, like it's gonna flood, right? And if it floods, they don't have insurance, they don't have someone to fix it up, so they would have to deal with it. They would fix it up, like even if they had a hole on the wall, what they would do is they would stuff newspapers in it, right? There was a lot of ways they would think about it, and a lot of ways they would use DIY, right? Their bed sheets would be used from the flour bags, right? And do you guys think that would be comfortable? I don't think so, right? It would be, it's not like our soft, comfortable bed sheets that we had today. Even electricity, even though there was electricity, they didn't have a use for it a lot, right? And even hot showers, water,
no
everything
running
was
water.
scarce, right? And even these kids, some of them, they wouldn't have shoes and they would walk barefoot. You guys could imagine how it feels like walking in the mud barefoot. Now we're going to talk more about and in depth about the American community, right? So we talked about events and traditions that they had, like how they would go to Catholic church and play baseball, and they would go to weddings, right? And you can see these images right here. You can see the wedding, you can see the church.
Yeah, so this would be like a first communion from a church.
Yeah.
Them playing baseball, and then here we see traditional Mexican clothing because they're celebrating Mexican Independence Day, and then a wedding.
And also, just a quick interesting thing is you can see here, this is Lorenzo Ramirez, the person that we talk about a lot, and his legacy that he has left behind is really great, and we're going to go more in depth in that later, right? And you can see here that these Mexicans wanted to fight. They wanted to respond to what they were doing and how they were giving them low pay, just like how they were paying them $2 per day, which was really low at that time, while the Americans would make double that, right? So they would go on strike. So like citrus workers went on strike in 1936. And also they fought a lot to try and get more rights because they said that the Constitution that they abide from is something that they weren't doing. Segregation is not set in the Constitution, and it does not support that. Here we're going to talk a bit about inequality, but we're going to talk about the Mexican community, a bit about the children and the schools, right? So here, just a quick thing, I want you guys to notice these two things. There are two pictures of Mexican schools, right? And you can see the desk, you can see the chalkboard, and you guys can just notice it and imagine that you were there at that time, right? Imagine how you would feel about, now that you know a bit more about this and about the segregation that was happening at that time between the Mexican community and the American community.
I also think that this picture is really important because it says training future workers. So a lot of the classes that we take now, like the math and sciences, didn't really, they didn't have them that available to them. So they were trained more, like the men were trained in like agriculture and wood shop and things like that, while the women were trained more in like home ec classes, so like cooking, cleaning, which we touched on a little bit already, but I think it's important to touch on it again, that they, even when they were younger, they didn't have opportunities like the white kids did.
So also, I just imagine this: 1 in 25 Mexican Americans went to high school in 1940s in Orange County, right? So around classes are around 25 to 30 students, right? And you get in a middle school, right? And you can see that the reason why it was 1 in 25 is that they knew they were destined to work as agriculture workers. Their high school degree wouldn't, their diploma wouldn't benefit them in any way. They wouldn't get a raise. They wouldn't get anything. So their thought process was like, why not start working after 8th grade and make money for my family and not go to a school and that punish me for incorrect acts that I haven't even done, right? So this is a huge thing that happened, and this is why it was so low that only 1 out of like 25 people would go to high school. Right. Also, California counties with Mexican schools in the 1930s. You can see that some counties had smaller amount of schools, so there was a higher chance that these Mexicans went to American schools, right? So, but you can see like San Bernardino, Orange County, LA, they have the highest amount, even though some of them are some of the smaller counties that are in the Southern California. Like Riverside is extremely bigger than Orange County, but it has only 2 Mexican schools, while Orange County has 14. A class action victory and a class action lawsuit, right? So here we're going to talk about Mendez et al. Versus Westminster School District et al. Et al., which means and others, of equal importance. So when we talk about Mendez et al., we're talking about the 5 families, and when we want to talk about Westminster et al., right, we're talking about all 4 school districts, right? And just a quick recap. A class action suit is when you go on behalf of a bigger community. So these 5 families, they were going on behalf of the Mexican community, right? And the best way to explain this is, let's say you wanted a class bet, right? What you would do is you don't go to your teacher by yourself, because you go as a bigger community because it's more convincing, there's more reasoning, and it shows that you guys are united. And that's what the Mexicans tried to do. So one way was through petitions, right? And when the court case happened, right, they fought. And David Marcus, a lawyer, he did it pro bono, which is meaning for free, right? It started in 1945, right? And the court case, they won. The judge ruled in favor with the plaintiffs, right? They had great arguments, and they said that what they're doing is incorrect and it's unconstitutional, and they won. But what the school districts did is they did an appeal, right? A great example of an appeal, not in the law area, is an appeal is, for example, let's say you want to go to a sleepover, right? You go ask mom, she says no. Usually what we do is we go and ask dad, right? Because one parent to another, that's what an appeal is. Because the school districts didn't get the answer they wanted to keep segregation, right? So they went to another court case. The court case was in San Francisco, and it was in 1947. And again, they fought and they won. The judge ruled in favor with the plaintiff, and California was the first school to be desegregated in the United States.
One started, the very first court case happened in LA, and then we moved to San Francisco, but also the whole court case as a whole took 2 years. So it's a really long, hard fought battle between the two. So it's important to remember that the 2 appeals is why the court case took 2 years.
And it took longer before that just for them to set up. So it took them 2 years with the lawyer to find an argument, to find the case before they even went to it. So it takes a long process for them, and the appeal to be upheld, it took 2 years. So imagine 6 years of fighting and 6 years of a lot of your time and effort just to try and stop this, right? If someone puts that much effort and thing in it, it means it's something important. So here I just want to go a bit in depth about the court case, right? So the whole argument that these defendants had, right? Defendants are the 4 school districts, right? Is that they were separate but equal. These 2 facilities were separate and equal, which they were not. And what you guys learned, do you guys think it was separate and equal? No, right? Yeah. It was never separate and equal. So they were fighting, and they got a result. They got that the judge agreed with them, and they went to the other court case, how we talked about. They did an appeal, and they won again, right? Here, I just want to highlight one person, right? The attorney, David Marquez, he's the one that filed the lawsuit, and usually lawsuits take a lot longer, but thankfully it was in the same year, where they went to the federal district court in Los Angeles, and then they went to a higher court in San Francisco. So here we're going to be talking about the unfinished legacy, right? So what these 5 families left, and what the lawyer David Marcus left, and even the judge, what they all left was desegregation, right? Their whole legacy was the desegregation of schools not nationwide, statewide, right? And it was in California specifically. So California was the first state to be desegregated, right? And that led to other states becoming desegregated. So in 1947, 22 states required or allowed segregated schools, right? After that, this led to another court case, Brown versus Board of Education, right? And the lawyer even watched these court cases to learn what they did and how they compelled their argument that segregation is incorrect, right? And they won the court case, right? And the Board of Education, they desegregated schools nationwide, right? So their legacy, even though many of them, they passed away before Brown versus Board, sadly, right? Their legacy that they left behind is not just desegregating schools in California. They technically were the building stones and the stepping stones to desegregating schools nationwide. Even though why they wanted to fight for this is for their children and for their community, they fought for all of us. So right now, right, we can't be where we're at without them, right? Maybe some of us that are Americans, but people that are immigrants, people that are from people of color or race or ethnicities, right? We wouldn't have this chance without Mendez, without these 5 families and what they did.
And the reason that the judge and David Marcus are so important is because that they showed that legally we can make change, not only within our communities, but also within the law.
Yes. So here we're talking about legacy, right? So this whole section or this whole court case, it's part of a bigger thing. It's part of a legacy. It's part of these 5 families' legacy, right? And what they did empowered other people and people in the Mexican community to do something in education, to do something in space, to do something to be a politician, right? And you can see this here, like Ellen, for example, right? She became an astronaut, right? Caesar became a dean in education of libraries in California State University of San Bernardino, and even the author of Mendez versus Westminster, right, talking about their legacy and talking about how the court case happened. And you can see U.S. Court of Appeals, Mary, right? And even because they knew this was such a big stepping stone, and after what they admitted what they did was wrong, the U.S. Postal gave them a stamp to show them what they did was correct, and to empower the people that if you think there's something wrong, that you should speak up. You should go talk to a lawyer, talk to someone, and see what there was, right? This is what we want you guys to do, right? And we want you guys to learn about this.
So this panel is all about inequality. We've talked about it a little bit on the panels, but it's important to remember that this whole case was based on the fact that people can be separate but equal. Obviously, now we know that wasn't true, but the white people in America and the law stated that things could be separate. So schools, pools, community events could all be separate. Churches could be separate as long as they were equal. But back then, everything was separate, but nothing was equal. So a lot of kids didn't have, their teachers weren't paid as much, their schools weren't as nice, their school books weren't as nice. So yeah, and then again, we could talk about de jure segregation and de facto segregation, which we'll talk about more later. But for now, you need to know that the fact that the principle of separate but equal was implemented, and it was the base of the case, and it wasn't true in the end. So David Marcus was the attorney for the plaintiffs, and this is important because it's hard for regular civilized people to represent themselves within the court. So David Marcus was a game changer because he did it for free, which was a huge for all these 5 families. And he also helped to prove that segregation could be fixed within the law and not just within communities. So David Marcus, he represented the 5 families, and he was the one that said, we need to do this as a class action lawsuit and not just as individual lawsuits, which obviously made their case stronger, and he represented the plaintiffs within the court case.
Also, he's done other court cases that helped the community. So there was a Mexican person who bought a new house in Fullerton, and the Americans tried to kick him out just because he was Mexican, even though he owned it and he paid for it. So David Marcus helped with that. So you guys have to remember, David Marcus helped with he tried to help a lot of court cases and help with civil rights at that time because he saw that there was a huge issue in that, and he tried to do an old pro bono, meaning free.
Paul McCormick was also a very big part of this case. He was the judge that decided on February 19th, 1946, that he ruled in favor of the plaintiffs, meaning he sided with the Mexicans in the desegregation of schools. Obviously, again, this is really important because it showed that within the law, we can desegregate schools as well as other things. But I'm sure he wasn't very sure if separate but equal schools showed discrimination, but as the lawyers and all of the plaintiffs proved him wrong, and then he ruled in favor of the plaintiffs.
Yeah, as the lawsuit unraveled and they showed the evidence that it was not being separate and separate but equal, right, he ruled in favor with the plaintiff.
So in this section, we're going to talk about the 5 families, which again is really important because they are the backbone to this whole court case. So the 5 families, as you can see, will go from right to left. We have the Mendez family, the Ramirez family, the Guzman family, the Estrada family, and the Palomino family. So the fathers are really important to this case, but also have to remember that the fathers were affected because of their kids, and it wasn't just men or women that were being affected in terms of school. We had girls and boys that were being affected by the desegregation of schools. So these 5 families are really important to remember because they are the backbone of this case.
And a great way to remember it is with an acronym GREMP. G-R-E-M-P. G stands for Guzman, R stands for Ramirez, E stands for Estrada, M stands for Mendez, and P stands for Palomino.
Okay, we're rolling.
Okay, so these desks are original from the 1940s, and these were built for 3rd graders, but it's from the time that we're talking about, and Kimberly can demonstrate. But the biggest difference between these desks and the ones we have now is that the actual table you write on is attached to the chair in front of you. So if somebody is shaking a little bit, or a girl flips their hair back and is in your way, you're just a lot closer together. And a lot of this had to do with the fact that there wasn't that many Mexican schools. So they had to fit a lot more kids in schoolhouses, which you can see in some pictures back here. But the spaces were really tight. So even if Kimberly was sitting right here, my desk would typically be right next to her, and hers would be right next to somebody else to fit more kids into one schoolhouse, which again, not very comfortable. It's not a great learning environment, very different to what we have today. So you can just see how tight and cramped the space is, and sitting here for 6 hours a day would not be the most comfortable thing in the world. So That's the most important part, is that these desks are original from that time, and it gives you a good idea of how tight and cramped and how difficult it was to learn for these kids.
And also, we didn't have regular pens or pencils. So if the way they would write is, if you see these, there's like holes in the desk where you would put your ink cartridge, and then you would dip it into the ink, and you would write. And they usually force you to write with your right hand, and they force you to write in cursive.
Okay, so just like there was inequality within schools, we need to talk about, to understand the court case, we have to talk about inequality within life. So the parents worked manual labor jobs, and they were paid per whatever they produced, not per hour. So the men their jobs were to pick oranges, because we lived in Orange County, there's a lot of orange groves. So they would climb up on these ladders within orange fields and cut down oranges in a certain way. And if they didn't cut them down a certain way, it didn't count towards their produce. So they would use these canvas bags, which in here we have about 10 pounds. As you can see, they're really tall, really big. And by the time they were climbing back down the ladder, they were filled to the brim, and they were about 50 pounds. So as you can see, it's a big bag. And the reason that the 50 pounds is so crucial is because, it's not really easy to climb up a ladder as it is anyway, but when you have 50 pounds on your back, it's even harder. And if they're working manual labor jobs and they have this heavy weight and they're doing a lot of manual work, they're more likely to get injured. And if you get injured, you can't get paid. So it's really important to know that. And while the men were working in the fields, the women were working in packing houses and in factories. So this crate is also original from the 1940s, and this is what the women would pack the oranges with. So the crates had to be packed in a certain way, and if they weren't packed the right way, they didn't count towards their wages. And at the end of the day, they would come home with about $2. But the women had three main rules, just like many of us have in life and in classrooms. So the three main rules were they weren't allowed to speak Spanish, they weren't allowed to sit down, and they weren't allowed to sing. So they're working for hours and hours and hours in a day without being able to sit down, and they had to pack these crates. So in addition to that, they would get paid per crate. So me and Omar get paid per tour that we do, so per hour, or not per tour, per hour, and the women got paid per crate. So however many they produce is what they got paid. So obviously if their child was sick or they couldn't come into work that day, they weren't going to get paid, which was detrimental to their family, because living off $2 a day, which nowadays would be $30, was super difficult, and missing out on even 1 hour of work was detrimental to their days.
And if there was any mistakes or blemishes, right? So like this orange, for example, right? You see this a little blemish right here, right? They wouldn't count it. So you had to pick correct oranges. You had to cut them correctly, put them correctly, and place them in a orderly manner where you would get paid. But you couldn't get. Sometimes you wouldn't get paid for a tiny little mistake. So in this section, we're going to be talking about classrooms, right? There is many rules, but specifically punishment in classrooms, right? So they wanted to Americanize the Mexican culture. Americanize means they wanted you to forget about your Spanish, your heritage, your Mexican culture, and they wanted you just to focus on the American culture and the ideals that America has, right? So one way was through changing the minds of the youth. Right? So what they did was, if you spoke Spanish, mispronounced an English word, or even talked about a Spanish culture in general, like if you went somewhere, you went to a festival and it was resembling Spanish culture, one way was they would wash your mouth with soap, right? So imagine in front of all your friends, they wash your mouth with soap. How humiliating would that feel? How embarrassing that would feel? And that's what these kids would have to endure. And that's why some kids would leave the school and not go to it, right? Also, in classrooms, right? Usually when your teacher writes your name, it's usually a bad thing. least of the time it's a good thing, right? For them, because they had this incorrect stereotype, and I emphasize incorrect stereotype, that Mexicans were not clean and they did not have manners, if the teacher wrote your name on the board, that means you should go take a bath. Imagine if I told you in front of all your friends, in front of all your classmates, oh, you should go take a bath. You don't smell good. You're dirty, right? How would that feel, right? That would feel humiliating and embarrassing.
And not only were they humiliated and embarrassed by their teachers writing their names on the board, if they, despite their language and how they spoke, if they did something else wrong, they would get paddled. So a lot of times teachers would hit kids on the knuckles or on the back of the knees. And when you get hit on the back of the knees, you fall forward, obviously. So, and this is a good example of what a paddle used to look like. But also, some teachers used to drill holes in their paddles so they would go faster. But punishment wasn't only limited to soap in your mouth. And unfortunately, 19 states still allow some sort of punishment, not necessarily paddling or soap in your mouth, but in 19 states, punishment is still allowed in schools. So a lot of kids are still enduring a lot of this torture and inequality within their schools. So, as we've said, this whole exhibit's about a court case. So, in order to understand the court case, we've talked about Mexican life, and we've talked about the segregation and the inequality they face within life. So, the next part of this would be the actual court case. And in a court case, there's two sides. The way I like to think about it is offense versus defense. So, offense in this sense would be, people who are taking charge, they want to make a difference, they, like, quote unquote, have the ball. So, the offense in legal terms is called a plaintiff, and plaintiffs in this specific case would be the five families. So the five families and David Marcus, they are trying to make a change, they want to make a difference, the ball is in their court. And then we have the defendants, which again, defense, and as we know, defense, you try to defend your side, you defend your goal, defend your hoop, whatever. So the defendants in this case would be the Westminster School Districts. And here we have an activity to have people deeply understand the difference between plaintiff and defendants. So we have some quotes from the case or about the case, and typically we have people give us their best guess about whether a plaintiff said it or a defendant said it. So Omar will read a few examples and then explain that the people will hold up a card and tell us what they think, and depending on our answers, we'll either expand on why it's this answer, why it's not, or just move on if everyone got it right. So.
Segregation, by its very nature, is a reminder constantly of inferiority, of not being wanted, of not being a part of the community.
So obviously, we know that a plaintiff said it. So we'll have kids show up a card, and sometimes they'll switch it around.
Sometimes when they don't understand it, you would explain it. So in this one, it's just saying that segregation is just reminding one person is better than another. So in this case, right, the Mexicans are worse, this is hypothetical, the Mexicans are worse than the Americans and the Americans are better, right? This quote is specifying that thing, right? Another quote, Mexican children have to be Americanized, much more than our so-called American children. They must be taught manners, they must be taught cleanliness, and they must be taught manners, which ordainedly do not come out of the home.
Which again, we know.
So this one, all it's saying is that Mexican children have to learn American ideals and be Americanized because they are in their household, they're not being taught cleanliness and manners, and they have to learn this. This is why they should be segregated, which is completely incorrect.